Welcome to BackStory with Joan Goldstein. I'm Joan Goldstein. I have a guest who's come here, arrived here from London just the other day, although he's originally from New Jersey, and he's an author of an amazing book called When Your Life Depends on It, and subtitled Extreme Decision Making from the Antarctic. And I really found this book so fascinating, so interesting, and I'm going to let him tell you about it. So, what is the book about, and why did you decide to do it? Brad Borkan is the author.
Hi, Joan. Thanks very much for inviting me to be on your show. It's a great honor and what privilege to be here. And the book came about for a number of reasons. And it almost starts with looking at this photograph, this wonderful photograph taken almost exactly 105 years ago to the day. And it's looking at a photograph like this, taken in Antarctica. There's a picture of Robert Scott and some of his members of his expedition. And looking at the sort of work that they're doing, which is pulling the sledge, and they all use these British terms, sledge, and since they're all basically British. And when I look at that photograph, think about my modern life, and my modern life working for a large software company in addition to being an author, and thinking that, isn't this what our modern lives feel like? We're not necessarily literally pulling a sledge, but
sometimes it feels like
it feels like that. You know, whether
right.
those are budgets or targets or whatever is on the sledge. And it was looking at how do we bring some of these wonderful historical stories to modern life and develop some lessons for modern living based on what they did 100 years ago.
So what did you discover?
So, well, basically quite a number of things, which was the interesting thing about their decision making, and we really focus on their decision making, is that they weren't perfect decision makers. In fact, they were very flawed human beings and flawed decision makers. And there's many interesting things about how they approached decisions and dealt with life and death situations.
Because this is the frigid climate of the Antarctic. And it's extreme cold, and they have frostbite, and they also get scurvy. So there's a lot of life threats going on.
It's a tremendously adverse situation that they're in.
Yeah.
There's no, when you look at a picture like that, there's no communication. The only communication they really had was the ability to shout to one another. And in strong winds, even that's quite limited. And there's no, as you said, there's no natural resources. You can't even eat the snow. If you think, well, at least they had snow, they could get water, and you can't, if you put snow in your mouth and to melt it for water, two things will happen. One is you won't get very much water from a mouthful of snow, and second of all, you can start lowering your core body temperature, and which can have fatal consequences.
Right.
So everything they had, even the fuel for melting snow to turn it into water, they had to carry with them. And their destination you can't see in the photograph, but their goal is to get towards the South Pole.
To the South Pole, right. And no one had been there yet.
No one had been there yet.
This was an exciting thing. They were adventurers, but also survivors, as you point out, and also you show how they survived, or some cases didn't survive. I mean, you said they didn't have food, they couldn't grow food, they can't do agriculture, they couldn't supply water, they couldn't supply heat, and they were there for not only months, but possibly years, right?
That's right. Yeah, expeditions were multi-year expeditions.
Right.
And the interesting about Antarctic winters is, in the Antarctic winter, the sun never rises above the horizon as you get further and further south. And so not only they're dealing with colder temperatures in the winter, but also the challenges of living in an environment where there's no sunlight whatsoever, which is psychologically challenging.
Right.
And so it's...
And no way to reach for help, no one that you could communicate with, because after all, they don't have cell phones, and who knows if cell phones would even work there anyway.
That's right. Yeah. And they're fundamentally on their own.
Yes.
And I think that the way they cope with the challenges, and probably one of the best stories, one of the first stories we open with the book, is a story of three men, and they're coming back from a journey. They've been going out 750 miles, pulling sledges like as shown in the picture, and they're coming back, and one of the three men is coming down with scurvy, and they still have about 200 miles to go. And scurvy is fundamentally fatal in those conditions. As their distances to get back to safety are becoming, they're slowing down. So they've got 200 miles to go, and they finally get to about 100 miles to go, and he's so weak he can barely stand up.
This is Evans, Lieutenant Evans?
Lieutenant Evans.
Okay,
he can barely stand up.
Yeah.
And they get to a stage where they're pulling him along on the sledge, along with their supplies and everything else. So 2 men are pulling a sledge designed to be pulled by 4 men, and they get down to, because they already had lost one of their team members, and they get down to a stage where Lieutenant Evans says to them, just leave me behind on the ice to die. You know, I've got the scurvy, I'm just not going to survive, and just hopefully you two can survive without me. And they hesitate, and he says to them, I'm your commanding officer, I command you to leave me behind on the ice to die. And
they don't.
And they don't. But it's a poignant story because we ask the reader, what would you do?
Yes.
And I think this is one of the really interesting things. We try to put the reader into these various life and death situations and say, what would you do? How would you make the decision if you had to make that?
Right.
With your own, what would be your ethical and moral guidance?
Yeah, these are
that?
tough questions. And also I should point out that scurvy is a deprivation of certain fresh vegetables and that can actually harm you enough so that you may eventually die. I mean, this was often the problem with sailors and liners, and it took them a long time, it took science to answer the question of what is this scurvy and why does it happen?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they didn't understand the causes of scurvy, but the fact that they had to make this decision, and the interesting thing is that, as we explain in the book, that they actually don't leave him behind.
Yes.
And he does ultimately survive, but he survives because one of the 2 team members they get to about 35 miles to go, and they're pulling him along on top of the sledge. And they get to a stage, they realize they're running out of food, running out of everything. They just can't move forward anymore. And one of the team members, Tom Crean, does a walk 35 miles. So think of this is the distance from Princeton to Philadelphia. It's like 45 miles. So you're walking almost a distance from Princeton to Philadelphia. One man in the snow, already on starvation rations for 2 weeks. And he's got only carrying in his pocket 3 biscuits and 2 sticks of chocolate. And as he does this walk, he does eventually survive the walk. If he sat down for any moment during that walk and fell asleep, he'd die of hypothermia, and then the other 2 would have died as well. Right. And so he does this walk, takes like 16 or 20 hours. He arrives, a blizzard hits, and so the men that who are in the hut that he gets to can't go out and rescue Evans and Lashley, the other man, for a weekday and a half. And they do eventually rescue Evans and Lashley. Evans does survive.
Yeah.
And Rachel, remarkable book that he dedicates to Crean and Lashley.
Yes, and Crean was the Irishman, right?
He was the Irishman.
And Evans was English?
Yes.
Yeah.
And the
Scott was English too, right?
Yes, Scott was English as well. And
right.
so one of the interesting things, and what we tried to pull out of the book, is to say, what do we learn from that? What do we learn from Crean's walk?
Yes.
And what we learned is that actually all of us have this very strong mental and physical strength that we don't give ourselves credit for always, but that Crean was able to pull out in numerous situations in the Antarctic where he was just able, and other men did as well, pull out this incredible strength, mental strength, physical strength, to do things that seemed impossible. The other thing that we learned from these sorts of situations, and we write into the book, is that teams are not balanced. And nowadays, I think in work, and I know in the company I work for, we think of teams as being, you put 5 people into a team and everyone's going to do 20% of the work. And that's the way a team should work. What they proved is actually sometimes in a team, someone has to be a hero. And in this case, it was Crean being the hero. And the other team members have to step back and say, yes, we need to let this guy be the hero. And the team survives. And I think that one of the great lessons is that teams are never balanced. And somehow in business, we've come along the way and think teams should be balanced. But in reality, teams were remarkably effective in the Antarctic. And they were effective because they were never balanced. And they let certain people be heroes and certain people, the strong people, really pull along the weak people.
Yeah, you do a wonderful analysis of not only teams and teamwork, but also leadership.
Yes.
And you talk about leadership, and then you talk about the second in leadership and how important that lieutenant or that second person in leadership is. And I think many people don't understand how groups work, how teams work. And we all are required to, because we're living in a modern society. But we don't understand it.
Yes,
You don't understand how
exactly.
it works. And what this book does is it shows you this is how it works. This is how it can work.
That's right.
Not always work.
Yeah, it's a perfect situation because these teams were isolated and they had to work well together.
Yes.
But the interesting thing when you compare this to the Arctic or to other expeditions where teams did become fractured, and what caused them to be fractured. The remarkable thing here was the teams stayed together, partly because they're very strong leadership and partly because they have very strong bias for survival. They had a purpose in why they were there. They were there to discover the South Pole. They were there to do science, and they had a very fixed idea of what they were achieving for their country, for themselves, and for the world, which was to be the first to the South Pole.
So that's the motivating factor, is the higher purpose.
Exactly.
It's not just I'm doing it for myself.
Exactly.
Yes, and that helps push you on. It helps you keep on focus and beyond even your endurance, because some of the trips you described, they're going for what, days, hours, weeks, and it's exhausting and it's freezing cold and they don't have enough food, and you know, the fact that they survived it all was really questionable. So something needs to keep you going.
Yes.
Something needs to push you on. And you did compare the different leaders. There was Mawson, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there was Scott and
Shackleton.
And then there was the Amundsen, who was the Norwegian.
That's right.
And
That's right.
he was the one who seemed to have less of the higher purpose. Well, in a different sense. He wasn't interested in the science. He wanted to do something for his country, for Norway, who had recently separated from Sweden, and they wanted to establish themselves as an independent country, and you point that out. But Amundsen's focus was not on science. It was just getting there and saying, hey, I got here. This is mine. And the others had other interests, other purposes, and that's what kept them going. And you think about your own life, and you think about other people's lives. What kind of higher purpose do we have? And if we don't have that, how do we go on, you see? So it's a wonderful thing that you've done with the book. You've actually taken two levels. You've taken the history of the Antarctic exploration. You've looked at what happened to them and what they did and why they did it. And then you've applied it to today's life. So it's very much current. You know, what do we do? What decisions do we make? How do we make decisions? And you talk about planning ahead and thinking things through. And even then, it's imperfect, right?
Yes.
Because you don't have all the answers. You don't know.
That's right. I think there were a number of things that they were remarkably good at, even though they didn't always make perfect decisions. One of the things they were really good at was whenever they came to a decision point, they made a decision. They didn't procrastinate.
Right, you said that.
And I think that we have a tendency nowadays to procrastinate. And part of our reason for procrastination is because we think we can collect more and more information. With the internet and with Google, you can very easily collect more information if you're buying a house or buying a car, or changing jobs, or even finding the right person to date. You have so many choices nowadays, and you can keep collecting more and more and more information. And the reality is that when they had situations, they just made a decision. And then when they made that decision, they said, if it's not the right decision, if it turns out to be a bad decision, how do we make the very best outcome from that bad decision? How do we bind together as a group or as a team and make and have a good outcome from a bad decision?
Yes, so you don't always get to the goal, but you get to survive.
Yes.
And that's the bottom line.
And
yes?
sometimes it's better to make a decision and even rather than procrastinate.
Yes.
And procrastinating is actually one of the things that challenges us today, and certainly in business, and I think in our personal lives as well, that people have there's this myth, I can make the perfect decision. And you can't. Sometimes it's just better just get on with it. Just say, okay, this is the house I'm going to buy. I'm going to buy the house, and now we'll make the very best of that house.
Yeah.
So
it's an awareness that you don't control everything.
Yes, exactly.
You know, but you take charge of what you can take charge of, but you don't control everything. You don't control the snow. They go out and they get into a snowstorm, and they didn't expect the snowstorm. And that's certainly a case with severe weather. You know, I told you I was a cross-country skier and a hiker, and I had a few sort of survival experiences of my own. And I also understood the need for good leadership. That became very clear to me. I also, the other night, I told you after I read your book, I woke up during the night and remembered as a little tiny girl in a little public school in New York, we had a guest speaker one time, and he was the explorer from the North and the South Pole. And I said, I remember that he was wearing this heavy fur parka. He was dressed, you know, and I'm staring at him. And I'm this little girl looking at this hero. And I said, oh, his face is so red. It must be from all the cold, you know. And I couldn't think of his name. And I sent Brad an email, and he knew exactly who I was talking about, right? Richard C. Byrd?
That's right.
Yeah,
right.
Richard. And it did come back. Oh, that's right. That was his name.
Yeah,
Richard C. Byrd. So they were our heroes.
Yes.
They were our heroes. And this is an interesting book for using in for students. And you said you're interested in pursuing making this into more of a book for teenagers who face all these choices and decisions in life and could use this as a help. And I'm going to use this book when I'm teaching my sociology course, my social problems course. I'm going to use this book with my students as well. I think. Yeah.
That's great. That's just very exciting to hear that.
Yeah, well, I think it's very well written. And I love the way you turn in each chapter, you present the situation, and then you say to the reader, what would you do? So you always include the reader in the decision-making question. It's not external, it's within us all that you're challenging us.
Yes, that's right. We're not trying to be prescriptive and say, this is what you learn from these things. It's almost like this is sort of what David and I, my co-author, learned or gleaned from this situation, but what do you take away? Because what different people take different things away. And
that's
David,
true.
And there are interesting cases where David and I were united. Almost everything that we did on the book, we saw things exactly the same. But there's an interesting little story where we disagreed on what would happen, what we would have done had we been there. And there was a story that Amundsen got to the South Pole first, and when he arrived at the South Pole, he left a tent to mark, this is where I think the South Pole is. Yeah. And he left 2 letters inside the tent because he knew Scott was coming up. Scott would arrive sooner or later to the South Pole, and realized Amundsen got there first. So he left 1 letter for Scott. Right. And in the letter for Scott, he said, you know, this other letter I left, that's for the King of Norway. Would you deliver it to him as proof that I got here first? And I said, if that was me, I would have ripped the letter up and thrown it away. And David said, oh, no, the honorable thing to do would be to keep the letter and carry it with you.
And what did Scott do?
And Scott did indeed keep the letter. And there's a little interesting story from that as well, which is that Scott kept the letter, but Scott didn't survive coming back. He and his men perished on the journey back. Right. And so when his remains were found, they found Scott's tent and Scott and his colleagues in the tent. They found the letter. And Lieutenant Evans, who we talked about before, the one who almost died of scurvy, he ultimately delivered it to the King of Norway.
Oh my.
And on that trip, he actually, delivering it on the trip to deliver to the King of Norway, he actually met a Norwegian woman, fell in love, and married this Norwegian woman.
Norway.
No, he didn't stay in Norway, but he did.
But he did bring a Norwegian.
He ended up, had Scott done what I would have suggested, was to rip the letter up.
That would never happen.
Never would have met
He would never have met that woman. And by the way, your co-author's name is David Hirzel, Hirzel. And you say he lives in California.
That's right.
And you two co-authored this book, even though you were in London and he was in California. Now, how did that work? How did that happen?
Well, it's actually quite an interesting collaboration but with modern technology between Skype and email and just trading documents back and forth. And we spent 3 months working on the table of contents. What would be in the book, what would not be in the book. And we eventually agreed on the table of contents, and then it sort of naturally fell into who would write which chapter. And we worked closely with an editor to help us make sure we were fine-tuning various parts of it, and that we were trying to get a single style, so it reads like it was written by one person.
I think it does read that way too. Yes.
But it's David's more of a Antarctic historian, and I'm more focused on the decision making and the decision sciences, of which I have my background's in decision making, decision theory. So combining our two interests made for a very good collaboration.
Yeah, that's a good team. That's a good team. Each one brings their own together, but you both agreed you were pretty much on the same page about what you wanted to do and what you wanted to explore. And it was a very, very successful project. And I don't know, when I was sitting and reading it, I'd get cold.
Yes.
I'd remember being in the cold, and I'd sort of feel, well, what's happening? Why am I feeling cold? Because you so captured that climate, that severity of the Antarctic, and all of the deprivation that go. Even if you had your laptop there, that wasn't going to help you get food. That wasn't going to help you stay warm. And these very bare bones survival issues were very important. So I love the book, and I love the way you organized it, and be sure to tell David I felt that way too. So you said you're going to go on to do, people are saying, what are you going to do next, Brad, right? And so what have you thought you're going to do next?
Well, David and I have talked about this quite a bit, and there's two alternative things that we're going to do with the book. One is to write a book for teenagers, because the survival, as you mentioned, the survival stories are just amazing, and teenagers face various types of adversity. So the survival stories and how those explorers dealt with adversity and overcame bouts of bad luck that could feel like those bad lucks are going on forever and ever and ever, and yet they were able to overcome them. And I think they're wonderful stories and lessons for teenagers. And the other is to make it much more of a business book, or to write a version that is very specifically geared towards businesses and business decision making. And you can almost think of these expeditions as mini startups.
Oh.
And I mean, they had to raise money, they had to go out and buy equipment, buy ships, and undertake various initiatives and set goals, and then reimburse their investors. And so there's a lot of things that you can gain from looking at the expeditions as giving lessons for small businesses and just business decision making in general.
Yeah, and going back to Scott, the interesting thing was finding their diaries. They knew they were dying. They knew they were not going to survive. And they spent whatever time they had left keeping journals or diaries. And they were found.
Yes.
And what came out of them? What those who've read and reviewed these diaries, what did they learn?
Well, the most remarkable statements of, Scott writes about bravery and camaraderie and respect, and his words are just very moving and very touching, and they all did this. And the interesting thing, I've met a number of polar explorers over the years, and they'll all say the same thing, which is after a day's work in the Antarctic or in the Arctic regions, you're so bone tired, you can barely pick a pencil and say, that was a hard day. And that's about all they can write in their diary. They're so tired. And Scott and his men are writing the wonderful prose about their adventures and about their challenges. And even when they're dying, they're just amazing letters to loved ones and letters home and letters to some of their financial backers and things like that. Just talking about their adventures, and they were not filled with blame and anger, and they really just accepted situations as they were.
And also, wasn't there one, I'm trying to remember which one you wrote about, he's struggling, he's hanging over a crevasse, he's not going to get himself out of this crevasse, he's trying to get him up, and and he remembers a poem, right?
Yes.
Well,
yes.
You remember what the poem was?
I don't remember the exact words of the poem, but it was, and the story is about Robert Mawson.
Okay,
Douglas Mawson.
Douglas Mawson.
And he's on his own. He was with two other companions, and they both died in tragic circumstances. And he's on his own, and he's trying to get back to base camp, to his base camp on his expedition, and he falls in a crevasse. And the only thing that saves him from plunging to his death, is the sledge is stuck at the top.
Yeah.
And he's hung by this harness, the same sort of harnesses you're seeing in the photograph, and he's hanging there and trying to climb up in his wet, frozen clothing, boots and everything. So you can imagine how heavy and that clothing would be. He's already been on starvation rations for a long time. And he's hauling himself up, and just as he's getting over the edge of the crevasse breaks away, and he falls back down again. And luckily the sledge doesn't come down on top of him. It still stays stuck where it was. And he tries, and he's just like, what do I do now? It's like, do I just give up? Because no one knows I'm here, no one's gonna come rescue me. And even if he climbs up, he knows that he may not get back to civilization alive anyway, because he's on his own and he's got very limited food. And he remembers a poem, and the poem is something about that dying is easy, but living is hard.
Yes,
and,
yes.
And I don't remember the exact words, but that gives me enough strength and that
Isn't
purpose.
that interesting?
And that sense of looking for inspiration beyond where we might look for inspiration.
Yes.
That there are interesting ways that we can think about adversity and come up with things that inspire us to achieve great things.
Yes, I love that, where and there he is hanging by literally by a harness.
Yes.
And he's close to death, and he thinks of a poem, and this poem gives him the strength to say, okay, I'm going to try one more time. And that works.
And he does succeed. And one of the interesting, I don't want to give away the whole book, they're wonderful stories. In our short time here, we're not going to cover all the stories, but I will say the one thing that was interesting was the ships that came down, they would come down, but they don't want to get stuck in the ice. So Mawson's ship was going to be heading back to Australia. And he knew, well, okay, I'm going to climb up this harness, but then I still have to get back to my base camp because I know my ship's going to be leaving soon back for Australia. If I miss my ship, I'm going to end up wintering over for another whole season and go through another harsh Antarctic winter. And he missed his ship by 5 hours. Yes. And, and it's just these sorts of things. There's every story is like that. Every story is just so remarkably tense. And I think that's what makes the book fun, is that you're reading about these situations, and for the most part, people survive, but they survive through very, very tough circumstances. And it's and fortunately, before the ship sailed back to Australia, they left a few men behind to help look for Mawson. So when he did get back to base camp, there were a few other men for him to overwinter with. So he wasn't then on his own.
Yeah, isolation would be another factor,
that's
wouldn't
right.
it?
That's right.
So this is a really wonderful learning for all of us. And I want to thank you, Brad Borkan, for writing the book, for coming here to my TV show, since you've been here just a few days from London and you're going back to London. So thank you for coming to BackStory with Joan Goldstein.